If you grew up Catholic, or if you're Catholic now, then the idea of confession is pretty familiar to you. The idea that you go up to a person, and whether you do it the old-fashioned way in a confession booth, or you nowadays priests are likely to meet with you face to face in chairs in a little closed room, or you say prayer of confession perhaps when you take communion, which we still do in the United Methodist Church. Confession is this really important thing. It's this really important recognizing that sometimes I need to admit that I've done wrong. And sometimes, the thing that Protestants notice is how specific you are when you're talking about what you've done wrong. We just, usually get along with just a little confession that's general, then everyone's reading the same thing and no one's saying, and I did this, and I did this, and So, I don't want to bring back confessionals necessarily, but I think they can do us good. There are times when we need to tell a story, and the story needs to include where I messed up. And I have to admit that. Welcome to the Takeout. I'm Jeremy Williams, and I'm the pastor at Community United Methodist Church in North Muskegon, otherwise known as CommunityChurchUMC.org. Glad you're here. We really want to include everyone, and that certainly includes Catholics and former Catholics, Methodists and former Methodists, and people who have no idea what I'm talking about. You're welcome. Glad you're here. So, confession. I really want to get into a specific use and specific place where confession matters, and that is in a conversation when we're trying to do something good in a community. One of the things we have to be able to do is to admit what has gone wrong in the past. And when we admit what has gone wrong in the past, usually somebody needs to say, and maybe that somebody is you, or maybe that somebody is me, somebody needs to say, and I have a part in that. I have had, an unfair advantage because of the wrong done to you. I have had a part in leaving people out. I have not communicated as well as I should. I have not stuck up for the rights of people in this way and that way. I have been okay when things have been bad. Owning up to something is what I want to talk about. And it's one piece of ownership. Ownership of the current situation that we're in. If I want to get into a conversation, and conversation is what I'm talking about for 6 weeks, and I'm in the middle of it. I want to talk about the kind of conversations we need to have that build community. We're really good at the kind of conversations that break community. We're way too good at those. But what can build community? Sometimes confession needs to be on behalf of people who aren't confessing. I am part of the group of people who are oppressing. I am part of the people who have an unreasonable, unfair advantage. I am part of that. And because I'm part of that, I have to come here and build your trust. I have to earn trust. And if I want to earn trust, I need to begin with saying, and I've screwed up. I've messed up. Not everybody believes that it's worthwhile or good or anything to actually confess. Some people think that it's nothing but weakness that would lead us to say, I've done wrong. But the Bible has a long tradition of confession. It's not always, or even usually, that you're reading in the Bible confessions by an individual to things they've done wrong. Not so much. More often, much more often, in the prophets and the Psalms, we're reading a confession of a nation. And when a prophet speaks on behalf of the nation to God and says, we've messed up, we've done bad, the prophet knows that not everybody in the nation feels the same way. And it would be the same today. If I were to say, on behalf of the United States of America, we've, done the wrong thing with fishing rights, or with preserving wetlands, or I'm trying to name something that's not political here in Michigan. Though probably they're both political in Michigan. But not everyone's going to agree with my confession. Not everyone's going to take it. But the prophets in the Old Testament go ahead and make confession. And I just want to read you one out of probably 100 examples of someone confessing on behalf of their nation. So let me give you a little story background. The biggest event in the Old Testament is called the Babylonian exile. You thought it was creation. That might be. You thought maybe it was the time in Egypt and coming out of Egypt in the Exodus. Well, that might be. But the center of most of the writing and thinking in Israel about their relationship with God was built around this one exile that lasted from 587 to 517 BCE. And one of the many prophets who reflects on that and thinks about that is Daniel, or the story about Daniel, which is probably written a couple hundred years later, but that's okay. Here's a prayer from Daniel. Why is the Babylonian exile such a big deal? It's a big deal because it forces the people of Israel to ask a question. Where's God? Is God mad at us? And if God is mad at us, why is God mad at us? Is God punishing us? Does God punish people like that? All those questions, which are pretty big questions, were all asked and answered in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people who are recorded in the Old Testament. And that's awesome. It's one of the awesome things about the Old Testament, that we have all these different answers, not just one answer. And they're all kept for us, a treasure from long ago. So here's one of the answers to, how can we worship God now that we've been taken away into another country? How can we set ourselves right with God when we can't do the things we used to do, like go to the temple? Well, the temple's gotten torn down. When we used to make sacrifices in the temple, and now we don't own a bunch of animals anymore, and we don't have the priests there, and we don't have the city to go to. We don't have any of those things. How can we get ourselves right with God? And maybe for you, the question is, how can I get myself right with my neighbor? How can I get myself right with a community? How can I build a better relationship with somebody? Well, it's messy, isn't it? It's hard. But here's the beginning. In Daniel chapter 9, Daniel reports on his prayer. Then I turned to the Lord God to seek an answer. Well, that's a good recommendation for you right there. It would not do you any harm to go to God and say, what to do now? That'd be good. I turned to the Lord God to seek an answer by prayer and supplication with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. In other words, I was going all the way. I was all in on this. I was going to confession, but I was wearing clothes that were intentionally uncomfortable. I was doing uncomfortable things. I was putting on all the symbols of penance, of saying, I'm sorry. If you were Catholic and you went to confession, maybe you were assigned things to do. You know, you were assigned that you had to say this many Hail Marys, or, you know, pray the Rosary, or Our Fathers, or do something else that was good to make up for it. You know, to reestablish a relationship with God. And for his case, long ago, it was supplication with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. There you go. It's pretty serious. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, Oh, Lord, great and awesome God, keeping covenant and steadfast love with those who love you and keep your commandments, we have sinned and done wrong, acted wickedly, and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and ordinances. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our ancestors, and to all the people of Israel, or of the land. And then he says this, righteousness is on your side. Now, how many times, maybe you never do this, but I think sometimes our pride gets the better of us, and we're knowing I ought to make a confession. I ought to tell someone I'm sorry. I ought to say, and I did wrong, and I go ahead and I say, and I did wrong. And I lay out some of the things that I did wrong. And then I say, but you are also a jerk. You also messed up. We both messed up. So we can share in that. But the nature of a real confession is not to say, and I accuse you. The nature of a true confession is to say, I'm just going to tell you what I did wrong, and then I'm going to wait for you to forgive me. And I know if I've done something bad to you, that's hurt you, then it's entirely likely that you are not ready to forgive me today. It may be a year, it may be 20 years before you're ready to forgive me. You may never get there, but my job is to wait. And in a sense, we have to do the same thing with God. But when we go into a conversation and we want to build community out of conversation, the first thing is to say, I have been a part of the brokenness in our society. I have not come and talked to you sooner. I have not sought to build good relationships with you. And I apologize and I ask for your forgiveness. And I don't need to press for your forgiveness. I don't need to demand anything of you. I'm just telling you what I did wrong. I have to walk in with humility. I have to walk in admitting what he's about to say. He did say, righteousness is on your side, O Lord, but open shame as that this day falls on us. We are allergic to the idea of shame. I mean, when you were in junior high, it was so easy to be ashamed. You know, someone looked at you and they said you had pimples on your face and you were ashamed. And they said your clothes were out of style and you were ashamed. You carried it around as a burden. And maybe what we've done is become so inured against that burden of shame, which we carried when we didn't need to, when it was dumb stuff, that when we ought to carry a burden of shame, when we ought to admit that we have done wrong, and the wrong is riding on my shoulders, and the wrong is being carried behind me, and the wrong belongs to me, In the middle of all that, yeah, in the middle of all that, I really need to admit my shame, admit that I'm wrong, admit that hanging my head is the right thing for me to do. And that's why I can't accuse and confess at the same time. I can't own up to my own shortcomings and failures at the same time that I'm telling you yours. I have to just own up. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Otherwise, conversation won't actually begin. Otherwise, the person to whom I'm talking, the person who, if conversation is going to happen, I really need to build trust with this person, they're not going to trust me. They're going to know that I'm more interested in preserving my dignity, my empty, pointless dignity, than I am in actually moving toward reconciliation. I'm not actually interested in building community. I'm only interested in building myself. And that is our disease. So we are so allergic to shame. But open shame falls on us, the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and all Israel, those who are near and those who are far away, in all the lands to which you have driven them. By the time this is written, Jewish people are everywhere in what was to them the known world. Because of the treachery that they have committed against you. And the person talking, Daniel, is not just talking about other people. He is himself one of the people he's talking about. He's not distancing himself, saying, and I'm innocent, I'm just a reporter here. No, we have together done this. Shame is on us. Shame on us. That's what it means. And we are allergic to shame. And sometimes we ought to own it. Sometimes we need to own it, to admit our failures, to admit that we have done wrong, to admit that we come out of a sinful past and we have advantages that don't rightly belong to us. Sometimes we desperately need to admit, I have been wrong in this conversation. Come on, it's true of a conversation with your spouse. And you know how absolutely pointless it is to say, you know, I admit I did wrong, and you also did a few things wrong. Do I do that? Yeah. Is it helpful? Is it meaningful? Does it build trust and better relationships? Oh, heck no. Not even a little bit. So quit doing it, will you? And he goes on, and he goes on, and he goes on. And you can go read the rest of chapter 9. But I wanted to get to this shame idea. Open shame, O Lord, falls on us, our kings, our officials, and our ancestors, because we have sinned against you. Now, do you think that all those kings and officials and ancestors give a rip about all that he is saying, about the confession that he's making? No, they don't buy it. But he is confessing for his people, and we need to confess for our people too. We need to confess for all the wrongs that Christians have done in the world over many centuries. We need to confess the wrong of the Crusades, of the Indian schools. We need to confess the wrong of abusing and imprisoning people and justifying it with our religion. We need to confess. And we need to admit some shame. So just think about the other side of the conversation for a moment, and then I'll be done. I want to read to you a very short passage out of Isaiah, and it's out of chapter 65, and it's Isaiah depicts God answering, or God maybe calling out, saying, hey, here we are. Think not only of God saying this, but think of that person you need to have that conversation with, that you need to go make a confession to, that you need to admit some shame in the presence of. Think of that person saying this maybe. And think of God saying the same thing, saying, I was ready to be sought out by those who did not ask, to be found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that did not call on my name. I held out my hands all day long to a rebellious people who walk in a way that isn't good, following their own devices. I have been here, says God. And I have been here, says your neighbor, who is hurt, who is left out, who is damaged, who is cut out of what's good and available. I have been here. I have been eager and waiting for a conversation. And it's going to take me a while maybe to forgive you. It's going to take me a while to understand. But if you come to me, and God says the same thing, if you come to me and you bring your brokenness and you bring your hurt and you bring your confession and you bring your owning up to the past, you know I'm here, listening. I'm here, waiting. Let's make that conversation happen. Peace be with you this week. May you have a great conversation.